Hey everyone, my name is Brian Gu, and I am the Executive Director at 0xPark. Thanks so much to the EDCON team for having us here today. The topic of my talk today is this idea of what we call programmable cryptography, its relation to zero-knowledge cryptography, and how we think about this in terms of implications for the future of Ethereum and blockchains broadly. So first off, just to give a quick intro, 0xPark is a relatively new research-focused organization which supports what we call application-level R&D on Ethereum and other decentralized platforms. So projects that we either operate or support include things like Dark Forest. We build a lot of circuit primitives for ZK snarks. We work on a lot of infrastructure and maintenance of or third-party development on top of tool stacks such as Snark, Circom, Halo 2, and we do a lot of community building work as well. So as I mentioned, one of our most major areas of focus at 0xPark is applied zero-knowledge cryptography, which means understanding what is possible to do with zero-knowledge crypto to enable the next generation of Ethereum/decentralized apps, and what we need to do to get there. So we're going to be talking about applied ZK in the context of this larger idea of programmable cryptography. And first, what I want to do to motivate that is I want to explain a little bit on why it is that we are so interested in applied ZK. What are some concrete reasons why we think that applied ZK is something that's going to be really powerful for unlocking the next generation of these kinds of decentralized applications? So first off, I want to talk about two things that ZK allows us to do that are, I think, huge leaps forward over what was previously possible. So cool thing number one is that ZK gives us what I call an expressive language for claims. And rather than defining that outright, I want to sort of illustrate it with a handful of examples around identity claims and membership proofs. So one of the simplest kinds of statements that we can make with cryptography is statements like, I know a private key corresponding to Alice's public key. This is something that we've known how to do for many decades at this point. The invention of public key cryptography enabled us to make statements like this. And yeah, it's something that underlies a lot of the digital systems that we know and love today, including secure traffic on the internet as well as Ethereum. Slightly harder is claims of the form, I know a private key corresponding to one of Alice, Bob, or Charlie's public keys. This is a claim that is oftentimes in the literature referred to as a group signature or a ring signature. It's something that we do have cryptographic protocols for. They are special purpose built for these kinds of claims. And this is something that was invented soon after the ability to make claims like, I know a private key corresponding to just Alice's public key. And this kind of claim requires you to use a different cryptographic protocol. It requires you to use different math from the first kind of claim. And this math, depending on the scheme that you use, might not even be compatible with the first kind of claim. In other words, you need a different kind of key registry, a different public-private key generation algorithm in order to make claims like this versus that first claim. One thing, though, that I want to note here is that we have another way today of getting to claims like this via tools like ZK snarks. With ZK snarks, rather than having to invent an entirely new mathematical protocol and an entirely new key generation algorithm, we can simply add a few lines of code to our ZK circuit. So if I have a ZK-friendly primitive for that first kind of claim, I know a private key corresponding to Alice's public key, I can use that to build up to this idea of a group signature with just a few lines of ZK snark code. In particular, I can add the lines, for example, I can essentially make a ZK proof of the statement, I know some private key corresponding to a public key that I'm going to keep hidden, and that public key minus #1 times the public key minus #2 times the public key minus #3 is equal to 0. And because all of this is being done in zero knowledge, what this is allowing me to prove is that with that same key generation scheme, I can prove that I know a private key corresponding to one of #1, #2, or #3. So it's much simpler, it's much more compatible, yeah, next slide. And it enables us to go even further. So, for example, we can get into claims that are even more complex, such as I know a private key corresponding to one of Alice, Bob, or Charlie's public keys, and I can toggle the property that the other people involved in this anonymity set, if they want to prove that they did not sign or author this message, they can or cannot do so. So an example of this might be like, I might sign a message signed by one of myself, Alice, or Charlie. If Charlie wants to later on reveal that he did not sign that message, then he can do so. He can disavow the message. So this property of disavowal is something that requires, further iteration on top of those existing cryptographic primitives. If we're looking at the non-ZK snark kinds of schemes, you have to go to a cryptographer, they have to invent some new math, they have to invent a new protocol, and then you're able to make claims like these. Again, in ZK snarks, however, this kind of property is enabled by simply toggling on or off 1 or 2 lines of ZK circuit code. And you can make this compatible with your existing key registry systems. And finally, we get to claims that, can be just arbitrarily complex. Imagine things like, I know a private key corresponding to Alice, Bob, or Charlie's public key, and I either possess a signed attestation from one of these attestation providers, David, Eve, and Fred, or during a block with header X, I knew the private key corresponding to an account that held at least 32 ETH, and you can imagine chaining arbitrary predicates to this kind of thing. I think it's quite fair to say that there's no cryptographer in the world who you can go to with this kind of statement who would be able to come back to you with a mathematical paper explaining here's a cryptographic protocol for how you would prove this special purpose claim. But again, with ZK snarks, this kind of claim is something which you can break down into these very modular pieces that compose on top of each other. I build a ZK snark circuit for a Merkle inclusion proof. I prove a snark circuit for, knowledge of pre-image of a public key, and I can put all of these things together. So I think one way to describe what's going on here is that ZK snarks are turning what were previously math problems around inventing new math to build new cryptographic protocols for special purpose claims. It's turning these math problems into programming tasks. Now, if I have a new kind of claim that I want to make, I have a programming language for expressing that claim and generating a protocol that allows me to prove it. Cool thing number 2 that is closely related to cool thing number 1 is that ZK adds interoperability to cryptographic systems. So to explain what this means, I first want to define a couple of terms. First off, there's this idea of snark-friendly cryptographic primitives versus snark-compatible cryptographic primitives. Snark-friendly cryptographic primitives are cryptographic primitives like hashing algorithms, signature algorithms, encryption algorithms, etc., that are built specifically to be very efficient to run inside of these ZK snark kinds of environments. However, most of the cryptographic systems that we use today were invented before ZK snarks were even discovered. So at least in the near term, our most widely used cryptographic systems will not be snark-friendly, and yet we would still be able to benefit a lot from being able to build on top of these systems this larger language of expressive claims. So an example of a system that's out in the wild includes things like, key distribution and identity registries, such as, PGP key registries. Another example is, if you've ever used GitHub before, you've likely uploaded an SSH key that's either, an RSA public key or an ED25519 public key. These schemes, again, are widely used throughout the world. However, they're not engineered to specifically be snark-friendly. And finally, Ethereum itself uses the ECDSA signature algorithm. And this is something that was built into the protocol before we had access to these more powerful ZK-enabled tools. So what we still can do with all of these cryptographic systems is we can still make them snark compatible. And the way that we do that is by implementing these cryptographic algorithms inside of ZK snark circuits. Once we've done that, we can use them as larger building blocks to make these more complex claims in our expressive claim language that zk-SNARKs provide us. It'll be less efficient, but it allows us to reconcile, for example, RSA schemes with ECDSA schemes. It allows us to make group signature claims around RSA-based registries, et cetera, et cetera. So both of these cool things are examples of the power of programmable cryptography, which we can now get to defining and talking about in more concrete specifics. So the way that I describe this idea of programmable cryptography is that it is cryptography that can be layered on top of arbitrary computations rather than just specific purpose-built claims. And to contrast this with what we have so far, as we've seen in the previous examples, for most of cryptography's short history, the set of mechanisms we've been able to instantiate with cryptographic tools has been very narrow. I can make claims about very specific types of predicates, such as this message originated from Alice, or I can generate these very specific purpose-built read access permission systems, such as encryption, which enables me to have a guarantee this message can only be read by Bob. But every new specific mechanism needs a new special purpose-built mathematical protocol. In contrast, as we've seen with this example of identity claims, new cryptographic tools allow us to have a much more flexible and rich and expressive design space for the kinds of claims that we can prove or the kinds of mechanisms we can enforce with cryptographic security. So with zk-SNARKs, we just saw the example of moving from only being able to make statements like this message originated with Alice to now being able to compose arbitrary identity predicates, oftentimes in interaction with stateful systems together. With tools like witness encryption, we can enforce much more complex predicates on who can read data. So for example, we can move from the world where we can enforce guarantees like only a coordinator with a specific public key can read some secret vote that a participant, Charlie, has published. To do so, Charlie might encrypt this secret vote with the coordinator's public key. But now we can move to things like Charlie has committed to some secret vote that only attesters with a certain permission level can decrypt today, but which a class of auditors who are less permissioned will be able to partially decrypt maybe a week from now. And finally, smart contracts are also an example that I think spiritually lines up with this idea of programmable cryptography. As we've moved towards programmable blockchains, we've been able to move from the idea of coming to consensus on a special set of data transformations that are extremely narrowly specified, such as Bob can decrement his balance by 100 ether to increment Alice's balance by 100 ether, to this world where we're now able to execute arbitrary computations inside of consensus and compose predicates together. For example, at block B, 100 ether will be available for withdrawal by Bob, so long as Bob has closed his position in X smart contract and blah, blah, blah. You get the point here. So we can see that zk-SNARKs are examples of programmable cryptography in that they allow us to move from proofs of specific claims to a general purpose language for claims. Smart contracts allow us to come to consensus on data transformations of arbitrary complexity with Turing-complete languages. Things like witness encryption allow us to move from worlds where we can permission data to only be read by specific sets of public keys that we specify towards a language for specifying arbitrary predicates for read permissions. And in the future, we have even more complex tools such as fully homomorphic encryption, multi-party computation, I/O, maybe even things that we haven't even conceived of yet. And other teams kind of have different names to label what kind of underlies all of these systems. For example, the CERC team, which is working on a ZK circuit compiler, calls these things computational crypto systems. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about why I believe that there is a very natural marriage between programmable cryptography and blockchains. I think a priori this is not obvious, except insofar as smart contracts are kind of an example of spiritually what's going on with programmable cryptography. It seems like you'll have ZK circuits, fully homomorphic encryption, et cetera, on the one side. You have this idea of building these very powerful consensus engines on the other side. What's really the relationship between these two things? So to set up this argument, I first want to sort of illustrate an image or like a visual that I have in my head for what Ethereum starts to feel like in a couple of years. So in my head, the image that I have for Ethereum in a couple of years is that it is a massive coaxial cable that's carrying the world's global stream of consciousness. All of humanity's promises, bets, secrets, debts, dreams, all of these things wrapped up in this fat gigabyte per second coaxial cable that anyone in the world or any computing device can hook into, you know, at any point, basically. So in order to build this coaxial cable, we've had to make a few design decisions. In particular, one thing that both enables this coaxial cable to exist, but also is a major weakness, is that this stream is completely transparent. And that's a design decision, because in order to build legitimacy for this particular coaxial cable, this particular set of hashes that is flowing through the global stream of consciousness, this stream of consciousness needs to be auditable, it needs to be verifiable. Unfortunately, this brings with it a lot of weaknesses. In particular, there are a lot of mechanics that require things like information asymmetry or fine-grained permissions in order to even function. And I claim that, you know, when we talk about the weaknesses of the transparency of this global coaxial cable, the weakness here is not just one of privacy, which I think a lot of times people might frame as an ideological issue. It is also an issue of mechanics. There are certain coordination systems that don't function unless people have different types of access to data or the ability to execute on that data. So one way I kind of think about this in terms of analogies is what programmable cryptography allows us to do is it allows us to enforce and write read, write, execute permissions on this canonical data stream. ZK snarks might permission, you know, who is able to read this data, and even if you can't read the data, you can still verify that it is being written to properly in accordance with a set of rules that you're executing. And to give an example of this and why this is important, you know, maybe one toy example I'll bring up here is the idea of games. So when we talk about games like poker, incomplete information games, where people simply need to have different sets of knowledge in order for the game to be fun, we see dynamics like, you know, you can imagine in poker, it wouldn't be a very fun game if everybody could see everyone else's cards. And the fact that my cards are private to me is, again, not a matter of just ideology. It's a matter of making the damn thing work at all. So up until very recently, the only games that it was possible to build on top of these transparent data streams like blockchains were complete information games, where everyone can see every, you know, item, move, strategy that everyone else is uploading to the blockchain, and there can be no secrets that players are holding from each other. With ZK snarks, we can now introduce the notion of information asymmetry to this decentralized game, while simultaneously ensuring that everyone trusts the game is proceeding according to the rules that have been set out and fairly agreed upon at the beginning. So for example, one project that we work on is a game called Dark Forest, which is a space MMO RTS game that, you know, sort of resembles StarCraft, but everything is on the blockchain. And the way that we enforce what is known as the fog of war, in other words, that the location of your base is not freely accessible and known to everyone else, is through ZK snarks. And you can kind of see here there's a general pattern for how to use ZK snarks to introduce certain limited kinds of information asymmetry, to introduce more powerful kinds of information asymmetry or more complex sorts. You need these more powerful tools, potentially like fully homomorphic encryption or multi-party computation, et cetera. So in the future, how do we move from being able to make these simple operations on toy environments like games to converting this transparent global data stream into a data stream that still is seen as highly legitimate and accepted by everyone, and something which everybody knows is operating in accordance with the rules that were set out at the beginning, but still enables things like asymmetry in terms of read, write, or execute permissions. You know, we want to end up in a world where we can have interactions like I walk into a store and perform a cryptographic handshake with a merchant and a multi-party computation with an identity provider. After verifying their identity, I give them one token that permissions them to access some specific data on my preferences for a limited period of time, 60 minutes, and another that allows them to transfer a limited amount from my balance. Then I update my transaction history, which is committed to on-chain, but which is only visible to myself. An interaction like this today would not be possible with a transparent data stream version of blockchains that we're familiar with now. But with programmable cryptography, each of these interactions can be broken down into things where a ZK snark or witness encryption or a multi-party computation might be able to enable these kinds of interactions. The last analogy that I'll kind of make here is this idea of an ender chest from Minecraft. So for those who aren't familiar with Minecraft, basically, in Minecraft, you can build ordinary chests, which allow you to store items. So I can walk over there, I can place down a wooden chest, I can put 5 stone blocks into it, I can go somewhere else, and when I return to it, my 5 stone blocks are still there. One of the most powerful items in Minecraft is this thing called an ender chest, which is basically a chest that you can put down anywhere, or where you can put down multiple versions of, and they will all be tied to the same inventory, no matter where you are or where you're going. And that inventory is something specific to just you. So if I look in the ender chest, I'm going to just see my specific items. If I go over there and I put an ender chest down there, I'm going to see those same specific items. If someone else opens the ender chest, they're going to see a specific inventory just for themselves. And this is a super powerful tool, and I think a super powerful primitive in Minecraft for enabling higher level strategies or coordination mechanisms or whatever else. And I basically think that as more and more of our social and economic lives move online, we are going to need the tools that will enable us to build things like ender chests that are going to enable successively higher levels of more complex systems and more powerful coordination mechanisms. So that's all I have for programmable cryptography. If you're interested in learning more about 0xPark, Applied Zero Knowledge, or the other projects that we do, you can find us online at 0xpark.org or at the Twitter handle @0, like the numeral 0, XPARC. Thanks so much.